Okay, so you're with us today, and we're diving deep, really deep into this whole tangled web of Israeli politics and Qatar. We've got a bunch of stuff to go through, video clips, what they're saying are leaked documents, the whole works. And our goal is to really pull out the most important pieces from all this. Specifically, we're looking at claims of Qatari influence, like financial connections and stuff, in Israeli politics. And we're going to zero in on Benjamin Netanyahu.
Yeah, it's pretty wild right off the bat, just how many accusations are flying around. It's a really detailed picture they're painting.
Yeah.
Could be biased, of course, but our job, is to break down what these sources are actually saying and see if we can make sense of it all, for everyone listening.
Right, exactly. So let's jump right in. Let's start with these Raven Project documents, supposedly leaked from MEMRI, the Middle East Media Research Institute, and apparently part of this thing they call the Raven Project.
Okay.
One of the big things here, one of the centerpieces, is this letter from 2012. It's supposed to be from, get this, Sheikh Hamad bin Jassim bin Jaber Al Thani. At the time, he was Prime Minister and Foreign Minister of Qatar.
Wow.
And it's addressed to, hold on, let me get his name right, Yusuf Hussein Kamal, the Qatari Economy and Finance Minister.
Okay.
Now here's the kicker. According to these sources, the letter authorizes a payment, a big one, 50 million Qatari reals to Benjamin Netanyahu. So right away, you got to wonder, what was this payment for?
2012, huh?
Yeah.
That's interesting timing. Netanyahu's second term as prime minister. A payment that size definitely raises some eyebrows, doesn't it?
Mm-hmm.
What are they hoping to get in return?
Yeah, no kidding. And it doesn't stop there. These sources, they say the finance minister confirmed the money was transferred. Not through the usual channels, though. They're saying cash, handled by state security before any official transfer. Oh, and there's more. We've got these Hebrew text excerpts.
Okay.
Apparently, they detail even more financial support. This time, straight from the top, the Emir of Qatar at the time, Sheikh Hamad bin Khalifa Al Thani, and it's going to the Likud B'Tainu bloc. That was a major right-wing alliance back then.
Right.
The numbers, big again.
Yeah.
$15 million supposedly for Netanyahu, $5 million for Avigdor Lieberman. Direct financial involvement, if this is true.
Wow. These are huge sums of money, allegedly going to some pretty powerful figures. Important to remember, though, these are just allegations based on leaked docs. Nobody's verified this stuff independently.
Of course. This whole cash to state security thing, what do you make of that?
It's definitely a pattern, isn't it? Cash, state security.
Yeah.
Makes you think they were trying to keep things under wraps. If these documents are legit, that's something someone needs to dig into. I'd say the biggest thing here is this. The accusation that Qatar was directly funneling money to Netanyahu while he was in office. If that's true, it'd be a huge deal. It raises a lot of questions about what Qatar might have expected for their money. Which brings us to this whole idea of Qatari influence, these so-called agents they're talking about.
Right. So the sources, they claim Qatar set up this, kingdom of honey for two guys, supposedly super close to Netanyahu, Yonatan Urich, and Israel Einhorn.
A kingdom of honey, huh?
Yeah. The idea is that Qatar recruited them to polish their image internationally, especially with the World Cup coming up. But some folks are saying, hold on, this was a trap. Qatar wanted access, human and tech, to Netanyahu's office, even his phones. This goes way beyond money, right?
For sure. This is getting into intelligence, manipulation, using people close to the prime minister. Kingdom of honey, that phrase itself, it makes you think they were given special access, which could definitely be used for shady stuff.
Yeah, exactly. Then the sources say Qatar went on to allegedly recruit Eli Palestine. Again, supposedly to make Qatar look good globally. And the accusation is, all three of these guys, Urich, Einhorn, Palestine, they were operating as unregistered agents for the Qatari government. Being an unregistered agent, that's a whole other can of worms, legally and politically.
Oh, absolutely. Working for a foreign government without registering, it raises all sorts of red flags. Transparency, loyalty, conflicts of interest, you name it. If this is proven, there could be some serious consequences.
And here's where it gets really interesting. Think about this. What if Qatar had access to the Prime Minister's office, through phones, through people? Imagine what they could learn, how decisions were made, what was going on behind the scenes. They could even plant ideas, influence Netanyahu without anyone knowing. It's a pretty scary thought.
It's a huge national security risk, if it's true. A foreign government having that kind of access to a head of state could compromise sensitive info, change policies, who knows what else.
Okay, so now let's get into this Eli Palestine situation. Seems like this is more recent, based on the sources. After October 7th, Palestine becomes Netanyahu's communications advisor. At first, when this comes out, Netanyahu tries to distance himself, But then later, he does a complete 180 and brings Palestine back into the fold. What do you think was going on there?
Well, initially, I'd guess Netanyahu was trying to avoid bad press, right? Being connected to someone supposedly working for Qatar, especially after the whole Hamas thing, wouldn't look good. But then maybe he figured Palestine was too valuable to lose, so he brought him back.
Maybe, yeah. So in April 2024, Netanyahu wants to make Palestine his security affairs spokesperson. Big job. But Palestine has to go through the security clearance process, standard procedure, and guess what? He doesn't get cleared. But, according to the sources, Netanyahu keeps him on as an advisor anyway. That's a little weird, don't you think?
Yeah, I mean, usually if someone can't get security clearance for a sensitive position, that's it, game over. So him staying on despite that, yeah, it's definitely strange. Makes you wonder why Netanyahu was so willing to overlook that.
Right. Then, things escalate in June 2024. According to these sources, a reserve officer, military intelligence, their information security division, contacts Palestine. And this officer, get this, gives him highly classified raw intelligence, shared secret level, super top secret stuff. And they do it through his personal telegram, bypassing all the normal channels. That's a massive breach, right?
Huge. Sharing classified info like that, especially that sensitive, it's a big deal. Could have serious consequences for national security. And giving it to someone without proper clearance, that's a major screw-up.
Yeah, no kidding. So Palestine, his reaction, he goes straight to Yonatan Yurik, tells him about this crazy material. Then they start meeting, the officer and Palestine, at a synagogue in the Curia.
A synagogue?
Yeah, supposedly they shared even more classified stuff there about Hamas and Hezbollah, but verbally. Why a synagogue, you think? Trying to stay off the radar, maybe?
Could be. Meeting in public, but somewhere people wouldn't expect anything shady. Definitely adds to the whole secrecy thing.
Okay, so now it's September 1st. A report comes out about 6 Israeli hostages killed in Hamas tunnels because of government negligence. People are outraged, huge protests, and the accusation is Palestine and Yurik, they want to use that June intel to spin the narrative, make the protests die down. That's pretty messed up, if true.
It is, using top secret information for political gain. That's a whole other level, putting their own agenda ahead of hostages, national security, everything.
Yeah. So according to the sources, Palestine gives this information to News 12.
Big news outlet.
Yeah. And then he messages Yurik about creating $1 million story, something that would need the prime minister involved. But News 12, they say no. They won't publish it. They're worried about censorship, endangering sources, hostages, soldiers. They knew it was too risky.
Good for them. They recognized how sensitive that information was.
Yeah.
Publishing could have had serious consequences.
Right. So Palestine doesn't give up. He goes back to Yurik and then to Saralik Einhorn, shares the intel, tells them News 12 rejected it, asks Einhorn to get it published overseas, to get around Israeli censorship. Then on September 4th, they have a WhatsApp video call, Yurik, Palestine, and Einhorn. And after that call, Einhorn supposedly leaks the document to the German newspaper Bild, which publishes it on September 6th. What do you think about all that?
I mean, it's not looking good, is it? Sharing classified info, trying to get it published abroad after being shut down in Israel, definitely raises some questions about their motives and whether they were even thinking about the consequences.
Yeah. And then after the Bild article comes out, Yurik messages Palestine. The boss is pleased, he says, meaning Netanyahu, right? Like he knew and approved. And after that, the officer and Palestine, they're talking, and Palestine tells the officer to delete everything, trying to cover their tracks.
Yeah, that's pretty damning. Sounds like they were definitely trying to hide something.
Right. And then the sources say Netanyahu and his media people, they pushed the Bild story hard, trying to make the protests go away. So we're left with these 5 big questions about Netanyahu. Did he really not see the document before Bild published it? Why was Palestine still working for him after failing the security check? Why leak it to a German paper after it was deemed too sensitive for Israel? Why is Einhorn still abroad? And why are there seemingly no repercussions for these guys who are accused of major security breaches?
Yeah, those are all really important questions. Definitely need some answers there. It's all very fishy.
Okay, let's zoom out a bit. Let's talk about Qatar's influence overall and this whole thing about them sponsoring Hamas. The sources, they're saying Hamas funding isn't just some random thing. It's part of a much bigger network tied to the Muslim Brotherhood.
Okay.
Back in the 1950s, the Muslim Brotherhood, they supposedly moved to Saudi Arabia, Qatar, and Kuwait. And they used those countries to spread their ideology. What do you think? How important is that historical context?
It's super important, I think. To understand this whole thing, the money, the ideas, where it all started, Qatar's involvement with groups like Hamas, it might be part of a much bigger movement, something that's been going on for a long time.
Right. And they're saying Hamas is just one part of this, like this monster that wants to bring back global Islamic rule. And this whole network, they say it's got financial links to all sorts of Islamic movements, although they do say that Saudi Arabia backed away from it around 2000. But the claim is that Qatar, they're the ones leading it now. That's a huge claim with potentially global consequences.
It is. It's basically saying Qatar is at the center of this potentially dangerous global movement. It's just one perspective, of course, but it's definitely something to think about.
Then the sources, they say Qatar has basically conquered Europe through strategic investments, buying up assets, influencing politicians with money, the whole 9 yards. And even in the U.S., they say some of Qatar's biggest supporters are Jewish lobbyists. They say this whole conflict has exposed Qatar's funding of anti-Semitism at universities in the U.S. and Europe. That's a pretty bold statement.
It is. They're painting a picture of Qatar having a ton of influence around the world, owning assets, pulling strings in European politics, lobbying in the U.S. It's a pretty elaborate operation, if you believe it.
Now, this is where it really ties into everything we've been talking about. For years, they say, Israel relied on Qatar when it came to the Gaza Strip. This is important, so listen closely. This reliance, they're saying, it let Qatar send money into Gaza freely. No problem. It started, they say, back in 2014 when Israel allowed Qatari money into Gaza, and that screwed up global efforts to fight terror financing. It's a tangled web, isn't it?
Definitely. It's a very critical view of Israel's policies on Qatar and Gaza. Basically, they're saying that Israel might have made some short-sighted moves that ended up helping Qatar in the long run, even if it wasn't intentional, and that it might have even hurt the global fight against terrorism. Totally. Everyone's got their own interests, their own strategies. So even though the goal might be to fight terrorism, countries end up doing things that seem to contradict that. It's a messy situation.
The sources also claim that Netanyahu's office didn't really react when they were given intel about Qatar funding Hamas. And they compare that to how Prime Ministers Sharon and Olmert were all about economic warfare against terrorism. What do you think explains that difference?
Well, it could be a bunch of things, right? Maybe Netanyahu had different priorities. Maybe he saw the threat differently. Or maybe he just thought there was a better way to deal with it. It's hard to say for sure.
And then they drop this really concrete detail. Hamas payroll slips for their military guys. $800 to $1,000 a month. Do the math. That's hundreds of millions a year just for salaries, which means billions have flowed into Gaza, some from Qatar through this global network they're talking about, and some from taxes within Gaza. That gives you a sense of scale, right?
Absolutely. That kind of money, it shows you just how much it costs to keep Hamas running. And it really underscores the need to figure out where all that money is coming from.
And the conclusion they draw is Qatar isn't a partner. They're an enemy, actively trying to keep Hamas around as a strategic asset, which obviously goes against Israel's interests. They're even saying that if Qatar doesn't free the hostages, they could face asset freezes, Olympics cancellations, investigations, lawsuits, the whole shebang. So maybe Qatar isn't so untouchable after all.
That's an interesting point. Maybe they do have a weak spot.
Okay, last thing. Let's talk about this alleged 2018 meeting and the ongoing funding. The sources say that in 2018, Netanyahu sent Yossi Cohen, the head of the Mossad, to Qatar to convince the emir to give Hamas $30 million a month. That adds up to billions over the years. But didn't we just talk about how Qatar is supposedly an enemy? How does that make sense?
It's definitely a head-scratcher. Asking Qatar to fund Hamas, even though they're supposedly a threat, it suggests that maybe things aren't so black and white. Maybe Israel saw some kind of benefit in keeping Hamas afloat, at least financially.
And they remind us again about Einhorn and Urich running this campaign to make Qatar look good before the World Cup, even though Qatar supports Hamas and runs Al Jazeera. And Eli Palestine, while he's advising Netanyahu during the war, he's also advising Qatar on how to deal with the hostage situation. So many things going on at the same time, it's hard to keep track.
It is. It really shows you how complicated these relationships are. You've got people close to the Israeli prime minister working for a country that's supposedly an enemy. It's a tangled mess.
Yeah, no kidding. And they even talk about Palestine being there with Netanyahu during a high-level security meeting in June, talking about the fighting in Gaza and Rafah. How could someone connected to Qatar be allowed to hear all that?
That's a huge red flag. Having someone with ties to a foreign government on sensitive security discussions, that's a major risk.
And then they even mention Sarah and Yair Netanyahu staying at hotels owned by Qatar. It adds fuel to the fire, doesn't it?
Definitely. It feeds into this whole idea that maybe there are some deeper, more problematic connections between Netanyahu's inner circle and Qatar.
So think about this. Just imagine. a government backing Hamas, and at the same time, they have people inside the Israeli Prime Minister's office during a war. It's a crazy thought, isn't it?
It is. It makes you wonder what's really going on, who's really pulling the strings. It's a disturbing